The wind didn't just howl across the San Juan Mountains. It screamed a high, lonesome funeral dirge. For Elara Vance, snowed in, and a year a widow, it was the sound of her own solitude. But on the third day of the blizzard, a new color appeared. In the endless white canvas of her world, a splash of crimson, stark and terrifying, leading to a broken figure at the edge of the woods. He was an Apache, the very people she'd been taught to fear, bleeding out into the snow. In that moment, her choice wasn't between right and wrong, but between the ghosts of her past and the dying man in her present. A choice that would change her life and his forever. The silence of Elara Vance's homestead was a living thing. It was a heavy blanket woven from grief and the biting Colorado cold of late 1878. Her husband, Thomas Vance, had been gone for a year, his laughter and warmth stolen by a flash of violence she couldn't bear to picture. The official report said it was a renegade Apache raid on their way back from the market town of Redemption Peak. They found him beside their overturned wagon, his lifeblood staining the dusty trail. Now all she had left was this small, sturdy cabin he'd built with his own hands, a handful of cattle huddled in the lean-to, and the crushing weight of memory. The blizzard that swept down from the peaks was a monster, a white beast that devoured the landscape for 3 days and nights. It erased the world, leaving only the swaying pines, the complaining timbers of her cabin, and the mournful shriek of the wind. Elara was resilient, not by choice, but by necessity. She rationed her firewood, checked on her livestock, and spent the hours staring into the fire, her mending forgotten in her lap, as she traced the patterns of a life that was no longer hers. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind died to a whisper. An unnatural calm settled over the valley, the world muffled by a thick shroud of fresh snow. Driven by a need for motion, for anything other than the 4 walls of her silent prison, Elara bundled herself in Thomas's heavy wool coat, pulled on her boots, and took up a rifle. She intended only to check her fence line, to feel the sharp air in her lungs, to remind herself she was still alive. She saw it from 50 yards away, a disruption in the pristine white. A dark shape, half buried near the creek bed, and leading to it a gruesome trail of frozen crimson. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A bear, perhaps, or a wounded wolf. She raised the Winchester, its cold stock, familiar and strangely comforting, against her cheek. As she drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a man. His buckskin clothing was dark with melted snow and something else. Blood. A lot of it. Long black hair was fanned out across the snow, stark against its purity. His face was turned away, but the high cheekbones and the turquoise earring she could just make out told her everything she needed to know. He was Apache. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. It was a visceral reaction, born of fireside stories, newspaper headlines, and the devastating loss of her husband. Her first instinct was to back away, to retreat to the safety of her cabin and bolt the door. Leave him to the elements. He was likely one of them. A renegade. A killer. The thought was ugly, but it was honest. She took a step back, the snow crunching under her boot. But then a sound. A low, ragged groan, a puff of condensed air leaving his lips. He was alive. Barely. Elara stood, frozen, her mind a battlefield. Every warning, every prejudice screamed at her to run. The town sheriff, old Brody, had warned her about staying out here, alone. "This is wild country, Mrs. Vance," he'd said, his eyes full of pity. "It ain't safe for a woman on her own." He'd meant the wolves and the winter, but he'd also meant the Apache. But then she saw his hand fingers curled loosely in the snow. They were long, slender fingers, not the demonic claws of her imagination. His clothes, though torn and bloody, were intricately beaded. He was just a man dying in the cold, just as Thomas had died. The symmetry of it was a cruel twist of fate. Could she leave another human being to bleed out alone, no matter who he was? Could she become the very thing she hated, something merciless? The ghost of Thomas seemed to stand beside her. His voice, a gentle murmur in her memory. "You've got a better heart than anyone I know, Ilara. Don't ever let the world make it hard." Cursing under her breath, a mix of frustration at her own compassion and fear of the consequences, she lowered the rifle. She trudged through the deep snow to his side. Kneeling, she gently turned his face towards her. He was young, perhaps her own age, with a strong jaw and a proud nose. A deep gash ran along his temple, and his eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. His left side was a soaked, dark mess, a bullet wound high on the ribs. "Damn it all," she whispered to the uncaring sky. Getting him back to the cabin was a trial of fire and ice. He was taller than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She couldn't lift him. Using her belt and his, she fashioned a crude harness and began the agonizing process of dragging him. Every few feet, she'd stop her lungs burning her muscles, screaming in protest. The sun was a pale wafer in the sky, offering no warmth. The only heat came from her exertion, and the fierce, defiant spark in her soul that refused to let this stranger die on her land. It took her the better part of an hour to drag him the short distance to the cabin. The porch boards groaned as she hauled him up the steps and through the door. She collapsed against the closed door chest, heaving, listening to the sudden, profound silence inside, now broken by the stranger's labored breaths. He lay on her floor, a piece of the wild, dangerous world staining her sanctuary. The snow was melting around him, creating a puddle of grime and blood on the clean-swept floorboards. She looked at him, then at the empty rocking chair by the fire where Thomas used to sit. She had just dragged the embodiment of her greatest fear into her home, and now she had to save his life. The warmth of the cabin worked slowly on the Apache scout, but he remained unconscious. Ilara worked with a frantic, focused energy that left no room for fear. She stoked the fire until it roared in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. With great effort she managed to pull him closer to its warmth, and using Thomas's hunting knife, carefully cut away the blood-caked buckskin shirt. The wound was ugly, a ragged hole, bluish around the edges, high on his left side. It wasn't a clean shot. The bullet had likely torn through muscle and glanced off a rib. It was a miracle it hadn't killed him outright. The gash on his head was deep, but had stopped bleeding. The immediate danger was the bullet wound and the cold that had settled deep in his bones. She boiled water, her hands moving with an instinct she didn't know she possessed. She remembered her mother using poultices of yarrow to stop bleeding and willow bark for pain and fever. She had jars of dried herbs in the pantry. Thomas had teased her about her potions, but he'd never complained when they soothed his aches and pains. As she cleaned the wound with hot water and carbolic soap, the man stirred, hissing in a language she didn't understand. His eyes, the color of dark, wet earth, fluttered open. For a moment, they were unfocused, clouded with pain. Then they sharpened, locking onto her. Panic flared in them. Pure animal panic. He tried to rise his right hand, instinctively going for a knife that was no longer at his belt. "Easy, Ilara," said her voice, surprisingly calm. She placed a firm hand on his good shoulder. "Easy now. You're safe here. Just lie still." He stared at her, his gaze sweeping the cabin, the rifle leaning by the door, the tidy shelves, the rocking chair. His eyes were intelligent, missing nothing. He was assessing, calculating. He was a scout, a warrior, and he had woken up in the heart of his enemy's territory. He said something, a short, guttural question. "I don't understand you," she said softly. "I found you in the snow. You were bleeding. You'll die if you don't rest." He seemed to understand her tone, if not her words. His body relaxed fractionally, though his eyes never left hers. He was weak, exhausted, and in no position to fight. He watched her every move as she ground the willow bark into a paste and mixed a poultice of yarrow and comfrey. He flinched when she applied it to the wound, but he didn't cry out. His stoicism was unnerving. He bore the pain with a stillness that spoke of a lifetime of hardship. For 2 days they existed in this strange, silent truce, trapped together by the deep snowdrifts outside. The storm had passed, but the world was frozen solid. Ilara fed him broth, changed his dressings, and kept the fire blazing. He drifted in and out of a fevered sleep, sometimes muttering in his native tongue. In his lucid moments he would simply watch her. It was during these quiet times that the hard shell of her prejudice began to crack. She saw not a faceless savage, but a man. She noticed the way his brow furrowed when the pain spiked the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes. She saw a small, intricate scar just above his collarbone, the mark of an old battle. She saw the strength in his hands, even as they lay limp at his side. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. He woke up, his eyes clear for the first time. The silence between them had become less a thing of suspicion and more one of cautious curiosity. "Water," he rasped, his voice rough. She was startled. The English was heavily accented but clear. She quickly brought him a dipper of water, helping him lift his head to drink. He drank deeply, then sank back onto the pallet of blankets she'd made for him. "Thank you," he said, his gaze steady. "You speak English?" she stated a little foolishly. A faint wry smile touched his lips. "I scout for the army, at Fort Lewis. It is useful." This was a shock, an Apache scout for the U.S. Army. It complicated everything she thought she knew. He wasn't a renegade. He was a man caught between 2 worlds, much like she was now caught between her past and her present. "My name is Ilara Vance," she offered, sitting on the small stool near the fire. He hesitated for a long moment, studying her face in the flickering light. "They call me Kyle," he finally said. They talked then in fits and starts. He told her little about himself, but he asked about her. He saw the sadness in her eyes. His gaze fell upon the rocking chair, then back to her. "Your man?" he asked, his voice gentle. Ilara's throat tightened. "He was killed a year ago." She couldn't bring herself to say more, not the part about the Apache raid. The words felt like a betrayal, an accusation sitting here with him. Kyle seemed to understand. He didn't press. Instead, he told her about the snow. "The spirits of winter are strong," he said, his eyes on the flames. "They can claim a man's soul if he is not careful. But the spirits of the hearth, of the home, they are stronger. You have a strong spirit, Ilara Vance." His words warmed her more than the fire. No one had spoken to her with such simple, profound respect in a long time. She was seen not as a poor widow or a helpless woman, but as someone strong. Later that night, as she dozed in her chair, a cry from him woke her. The pain had returned with a vengeance. He was shivering, his face pale with agony. She rushed to his side, her heart aching for him. She gave him more willow bark tea and bathed his forehead with a cool cloth. He grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong, his eyes dark and intense, bored into hers. He was looking at her, but also through her, as if seeing something else entirely. "In my fever," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "I saw a vision. The snow was a white wolf, its teeth at my throat. And you were a mountain hawk. You drove it away. You gave me back my life." Elara didn't know what to say. She could only stare into the depths of his eyes, feeling a connection that transcended words, a strange and powerful current passing between them. He pulled her hand from his wrist and held it between both of his. His palms were calloused, but warm. He looked at her hand, then back to her face. His expression, one of awe and solemn reverence. "Then to my people we do not forget a debt of life," he said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant vow that filled the small cabin. "I was a dead man in the snow. You have called my spirit back. From this night until the spirits call me home for the last time, I shall love you until death." The words hung in the air, more binding than any law, more powerful than any fear. Elara's breath hitched. It wasn't a declaration of romance born of infatuation. It was something deeper, more elemental, a sacred promise forged in the crucible of near death and selfless compassion. In that moment, the lonely widow and the wounded scout were no longer strangers. Their fates had become irrevocably intertwined by a blizzard, a bullet, and a vow made in the firelight. The thaw came 4 days later, slow and reluctant. The world dripped and sighed around the cabin as the sun, now with a hint of genuine warmth, began to reclaim the valley from the snow's icy grip. Kyle's strength returned with surprising speed. The Apache resilience was no myth. He was soon able to sit up, then stand leaning against the wall for support. The awkward silence between them had been replaced by a comfortable quiet, punctuated by his soft-spoken questions and her gentle answers. He was a keen observer, noticing the way she mended a seam or the precise way she kneaded dough for bread, his eyes holding a quiet admiration that made her feel seen. The vow he had made hung between them unspoken, but ever present. Elara tried to dismiss it as a fever dream, a product of gratitude and pain. But the way he looked at her with an unwavering intensity and a profound tenderness told her he remembered every word. It was a look that both thrilled and terrified her. One afternoon, as Cale was carefully carving a piece of scrap wood into a small, intricate bird, the sound they had both been dreading finally came, the rhythmic crunch of hooves in the melting snow. It wasn't one horse, it was several. Kyle was on his feet in an instant, his body tense, his hand reaching for the knife she had returned to him. Who, he asked, his voice a low growl. Elara's heart leapt into her throat. She peered through the small window. 3 riders were making their way up the path to her cabin. She recognized them immediately, and a cold dread washed over her. "It's Joshua Thorne," she whispered, her voice tight, "and 2 of his men." Joshua Thorne owned the sprawling T-bar ranch that bordered her property to the east. He was a man who consumed land the way a fire consumes dry grass relentlessly and without remorse. He was handsome in a cruel, sharp-edged way, with pale eyes that seemed to miss nothing and see the value in everything. He had made no secret of his desire to buy her homestead. Thomas had always said Thorne had the shadow of the vulture about him. Since Thomas's death, Thorne's offers had become more frequent, his polite inquiries laced with an undercurrent of something predatory. "He is a dangerous man," Kyle asked, his eyes narrowing. "He is a powerful man," Elara corrected. "And he wants this land, the creek especially. It never runs dry." There was no time to hide Kyle completely. The root cellar, she hissed, pointing to a trap door hidden beneath a bearskin rug. "Get in. And be silent no matter what you hear." Kyle hesitated, his protective instinct warring with logic. A look from her fierce and pleading decided it. He gave a sharp nod, lifted the heavy door and slipped into the darkness below, just as the heavy thud of a fist echoed on the cabin door. Elara took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and schooled her features into a mask of weary neutrality. She opened the door. Joshua Thorne stood on her porch, flanked by two rough-looking ranch hands. One of them, a young man with shifty eyes, was Deputy Miller, a man who wore a sheriff's badge, but whose loyalty everyone knew was to Thorne's payroll. Mrs. Vance, Thorne said, sweeping his hat off in a gesture of mock chivalry. His smile didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. Apologies for the intrusion. The blizzard had us all cooped up. Just checking on our neighbors. I'm fine, Mr. Thorne, Ilara said, her voice steady. She didn't move from the doorway, blocking his view of the interior. Just fine, he purred, his gaze sweeping over her, then trying to peer past her into the cabin. A pretty woman like you, all alone out here. It's a dangerous world. His eyes flicked to the rifle leaning near the door. Heard some troubling news from Redemption Peak. Seems a U.S. Army scout went missing just before the storm hit. An Apache tracker. They think he might have headed up this way. Ilara's blood ran cold, but she kept her face impassive. I've seen no one. The storm was too thick to see your own hand in front of your face. Deputy Miller spoke up, his tone lazy but his eyes sharp. Sheriff Brody got a wire from Fort Lewis. The Army's mighty interested in getting their boy back. Said he was tracking some rustlers who hit a supply wagon. They're offering a reward. He looked pointedly at her small, humble cabin. A reward could go a long way for a widow. The implication was clear. They were hunting, and they suspected she might know something. Thorne's gaze was the most unnerving. It was as if he could smell the presence of another person. He took a step forward, intending to enter. I was just about to have some coffee, Mr. Thorne, Ilara said, moving to block him. But I don't have enough to share with all of you. Perhaps another time. It was a direct dismissal, a breach of frontier etiquette, and it momentarily surprised him. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He looked from her defiant expression to the smoke curling from her chimney, to the single set of tracks, hers, leading from the cabin to the lean-to. From below the floorboards, Kyle listened, his hand gripping the hilt of his knife. He could hear the low thrum of Thorne's voice, a voice that stirred a dark and painful memory. He closed his eyes, concentrating. He had heard that voice before. Where? The memory was hazy, shrouded in the fog of his ambush. Well now, Thorne said, his smile returning thin and sharp. No need to be inhospitable, Mrs. Vance. We're just concerned for your safety. His eyes settled on the bearskin rug. That's a fine rug. Must keep the chill from the floorboards right out. Ilara's heart pounded. She prayed he couldn't see the faint outline of the trapdoor. It does its job, she said flatly. Thorne held her gaze for a long, uncomfortable moment, a silent battle of wills playing out on the small porch. He was testing her, pushing her, enjoying her discomfort. Finally, with a sigh that was more theatrical than genuine, he put his hat back on. All right then, we'll leave you to your peace, but you keep a sharp eye out. If you see this Apache, you send word to me or the sheriff. He's likely dangerous. You can't ever trust their kind. He gave her a final lingering look. And do think about my offer for this place. It's not fitting for a woman to struggle so. I'd see you were well taken care of. He turned and swung up onto his horse. Deputy Miller and the other man followed suit. As they rode away, Thorne looked back one last time. His eyes narrowed in thought. He had seen something, or sensed something, that didn't sit right with him. Ilara stood rooted to the spot until they were out of sight, her knuckles white where she gripped the doorframe. Only then did she bolt the door and slump against it, her legs trembling. She lifted the trap door. Kyle emerged from the darkness, his face a grim mask of fury. That man, Kale said, his voice low and dangerous. Thorne. I know his voice. What do you mean? Ilara asked, her heart still racing. Kyle walked to the window, staring out at the tracks the riders had left in the snow. When I was ambushed, there were 3 of them. It was dusk, their faces were in shadow. But they spoke. They thought I was dead. I heard one of them, the leader, give an order. Kyle turned to face her, his eyes blazing with a cold, terrifying certainty. It was him. It was Joshua Thorne's voice. He was the one who shot me. Kyle's revelation struck the air from the cabin. Joshua Thorne, the powerful rancher, the man who pretended to be her concerned neighbor, was the one who had left Kale for dead in the wilderness. The pieces didn't fit. Why would Thorne ambush an army scout? But why Ilara breathed, sinking onto the stool by the fire? It makes no sense. What business would he have with you? I was not tracking rustlers, Kyle said, his voice hard as flint. He began to pace the small space, his limp more pronounced with his agitation. That was a lie for the army, for the white soldiers. My commanding officer, Major Morrison, he is a good man. He trusts me. He gave me a private task. He stopped and faced her, his dark eyes, searching hers, asking for trust. I was tracking the men who killed your husband. Ilara stared at him, speechless. The world tilted on its axis. Her husband, Thomas. The pain of his loss, a wound she had carefully bandaged for a year, was ripped open anew. What are you talking about? She whispered. My husband. He was killed by Apaches in a raid. That's what Sheriff Brody said. That's what everyone said. It was a lie, Kyle stated, his voice ringing with conviction. A lie to start a fire. A lie to turn settlers against my people, and my people against the settlers. There has been peace in this valley for 2 years. A fragile peace, but peace. Someone wanted to break it. He came closer, his intensity drawing her in. The raiders who attacked your husband's wagon. They were not Apache. They were white men dressed as Apache. They were clumsy. They left signs a child could follow. An arrow fletched with the wrong feathers. A moccasin print made by a boot. They wanted it to look like a raid, but they were careless. Ilara felt a wave of nausea. No, that can't be. Why would anyone do that for land? Kyle said, his gaze flicking toward the window in the direction of Thorne's ranch. For power. To create chaos so that men like Thorne can pick up the pieces. Major Morrison suspected this. He heard whispers. He sent me not as a soldier, but as a ghost to follow the trail without being seen. To find the truth. He knelt before her, taking her hands in his. They were cold as ice. Ilara. I followed that false trail. It led me close to the T-Bar ranch. I was watching gathering proof. I found a place where they had burned the disguises. I found a discarded shirt, a white man's shirt, with a T-Bar brand sewn into the collar. Before I could get back to the fort, they found me. Thorne and his men. They knew I was close to the truth. The truth. It was a terrible, blinding light. The hatred she had harbored for a year, the bitterness that had poisoned her heart against an entire people, had been directed at the wrong enemy. It wasn't a faceless Apache warrior who had killed Thomas. It was Joshua Thorne, the man who offered condolences, the man who wanted her land, the man who had been on her porch not an hour ago. The memory of Thomas's body, the official story, Thorne's cloying sympathy. It all curdled in her stomach. He hadn't just killed her husband. He had used his death as a tool, a weapon to manipulate her and incite hatred. He had orchestrated her deepest pain for his own greed. A single hot tear traced a path down her cheek. It was a tear of grief, but it was followed by another, born of pure, unadulterated rage. The image of Thorne's smug face flashed in her mind. Kyle saw the shift in her expression, the hardening of her features. He gently squeezed her hands. "The pain of a lie is sometimes worse than the pain of the truth," he said softly. "Your hate was a heavy stone. Now you can set it down." She looked at him, then truly looked at him. The man she had saved was not just a stranger. He was the bearer of a truth that could set her free, even as it plunged her into greater danger. His vow, "I shall love you," until death was no longer just about a debt of life. It was a bond forged in a shared quest for justice. He was risking his life to avenge a man he had never met for a woman he had only just known. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice no longer trembling but filled with a new steely resolve. The widow Elara Vance was gone. In her place was a woman with a rifle, a purpose, and a burning need for retribution. "First I must get stronger," Kyle said, his own resolve hardening. "Then I must get word to Major Morrison. But we cannot trust anyone in Redemption Peak. That deputy. He is Thorne's man. The sheriff may be honest, but Thorne's web is wide." "He won't stop," Elara said, thinking aloud. "Thorne. He knows I lied. He could feel it. He'll be back. He doesn't like loose ends. We will be ready for him," Cale promised. In the days that followed, a profound change settled over the cabin. It was no longer a place of mourning, but a headquarters, a war room. The shared secret and common enemy erased any remaining barriers between them. Elara tended to Cale's wound, not just as a nurse, but as a partner protecting her most valuable ally. Kyle in turn taught her things. He showed her how to read the subtle signs of the wilderness, how to move without a sound, how to listen not just with her ears, but with her whole body. He taught her how to truly see the world that had always been around her. She shared stories of Thomas, not with the pain of loss, but with the warmth of memory, wanting Kyle to understand the man he was avenging. He was a good man, a kind man, who had loved this land and this life. Kyle listened patiently, his respect for her, and for the memory of her husband, deepening with every word. One evening, as they sat by the fire cleaning her rifle, a comfortable silence enveloped them. Elara looked at Kyle's profile, the strong line of his jaw illuminated by the flames. She felt a surge of emotion that was more than gratitude, more than alliance. It was a deep, resonant affection for this quiet, honorable man who had come into her life like a storm and brought with him a terrible, cleansing truth. He looked up as if feeling her gaze, and their eyes met. The promise he had made, the vow to love her, was there in his eyes, steady and unwavering. And for the first time, Elara Vance didn't feel afraid of it. She felt home. They were two wounded souls from two different worlds, bound together by a lie that had torn one life apart, and now through its unraveling was beginning to build a new one. 10 days after the blizzard, Kyle was nearly his old self. His wound was healing cleanly, his movements regaining their fluid grace. The bond between him and Elara had deepened into a partnership of unspoken understanding. They moved around the small cabin in a seamless rhythm, a silent dance of shared purpose. But they both knew their time in this isolated sanctuary was running out. Thorne was not a patient man. His shadow was long, and it would soon fall upon them again. "I must leave," Cale announced one morning, his voice firm. "I have been gone too long. Major Morrison will think I am dead. I must get him the proof I found. It's too dangerous to go to Fort Lewis alone." Elara argued, her hands stilling in the bowl of dough she was kneading. "Thorne will be watching the trails. There are trails no white man knows," Cale countered. "My people are camped in the echoing canyons 2 days' ride from here. They move with the seasons. From there I can send a runner to the fort. It is safer." He paused, his expression growing serious. "But I will not leave you here alone. You will come with me." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. To leave her home, the only piece of Thomas she had left, and venture into the heart of Apache territory. It was madness. But staying here was a death sentence. Thorne would come for her, and she would not be able to stop him alone. "All right," she said, her voice more resolute than she felt. "I'll come." They left at dusk, packing only what was essential: dried meat, a little flour, her rifle, and the small T-bar branded swatch of cloth Kyle had recovered, their only tangible piece of proof. Kyle led one of her sturdier horses, and Elara rode the other. He moved through the twilight landscape, not like a man traveling over it, but like a part of it. He read the bent blades of grass, the silent flight of an owl, the very texture of the air. For 2 days they traveled through a breathtaking and unforgiving wilderness. Kyle guided them through hidden game trails and steep rocky passes that would be invisible to anyone else. Elara, who thought she knew these mountains, saw them anew through his eyes. He taught her the names of the plants, the calls of the birds, and the stories hidden in the rock formations. In this wild, open world away from the cabin that held so many ghosts, she felt a sense of freedom she hadn't experienced in years. On the evening of the second day, they crested a ridge, and Kyle pointed below. Tucked into a winding canyon, sheltered by sheer rock walls, was the Apache camp. Dozens of hide wickiups were scattered near a rushing creek, their cooking fires sending thin plumes of smoke into the darkening sky. The sight was beautiful, but it filled Elara with a profound sense of unease. She was an outsider here, a trespasser. As they descended, a lone rider emerged to meet them, sitting astride a wiry pinto pony. The rider was a woman, her face fierce and proud, her long black hair bound in 2 braids. She carried a short bow and a quiver of arrows. Nalin Kyle said, his voice a mix of warmth and caution. "My sister." Nalin's eyes were a mirror of Kyle's, but where he held a quiet watchfulness, hers burned with a fiery intensity. Her gaze swept over Kyle, noting his bandaged side, before landing on Elara. It was a look of pure, undiluted hostility. She spoke to Kyle in their native tongue, her words sharp and rapid. Kyle answered calmly, his voice a low counterpoint to her urgent questioning. His eyes kept flicking back to Elara, a silent reassurance. Finally, Nalin looked directly at Elara and spoke in heavily accented clipped English. "Why do you bring this white woman here?" "This is not her place. She saved my life," Sister Kyle said, simply switching to English for Elara's sake. "I owed her a life debt. You owe your life to the people, not to one of them." Nalin shot back her gesture, taking in Elara as if she were something unclean. "They are the reason you were shot. They are the reason our lands shrink and our children go hungry. She is the same as all the others." "You are wrong," Kyle said, his voice taking on a hard edge Elara had never heard before. "She's not the same. Her heart is true. She has more courage than many warriors I have known." The praise made Elara flush, but it did nothing to soften Nalin's expression. A small crowd was beginning to gather their faces, a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Elara felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, judging her. She sat taller in her saddle, refusing to show the fear that was churning in her stomach. An elder, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and wisdom, stepped forward. Kyle dismounted and spoke to him with deep respect, recounting the story of his ambush and of Elara's bravery. He told them of Thorne's treachery and the plot to frame their people for the murder of her husband. As he spoke, a murmur went through the crowd. They knew of Joshua Thorne. They called him Yellow Snake. When Kyle finished, the elder, whose name was Chirik, turned his ancient eyes on Elara. He studied her for a long time, his gaze seeming to strip away all her defenses, looking right into her soul. "The yellow snake is an enemy to us all," Kirik said, at last, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "Your man," he said to Elara, "was killed by this snake, and our people were blamed. Your path and ours have converged." He looked at Kyle, then back to her. "The scout speaks truly. You have a strong spirit. You may stay. But know this white woman trust is a seed that grows slowly in this barren ground." Nalin turned and stalked away without another word, her disapproval a palpable force. Kyle led Elara into the camp, the crowd parting before them. He was given a wickiup near the edge of the camp, and Elara entered the small, hide-covered dwelling, the smells of smoke leather and earth enveloping her. That night, as the drums of a ceremonial dance beat a steady rhythm through the canyon, Kyle sat with her outside the wickiup. The stars were brilliant in the clear night sky, more than she had ever seen from her cabin. "My sister is protective," Kyle said, breaking the silence. "She has seen too much pain caused by your people." "I understand," Elara said quietly. "A year ago I would have felt the same way she does." He looked at her, his expression soft in the firelight. "But you are not that person anymore." "No," she agreed. "I'm not." She was no longer just the widow Vance defined by her loss. She was a woman who had saved a life, who had unlearned a lifetime of hate, and who had ridden into an Apache camp to seek justice. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but for the first time since Thomas's death, she didn't feel alone. She was part of a bigger story now, a story of two peoples wronged by the same man. And her fate was tied to the Apache scout who had vowed to love her until death, a vow that was being tested not by an enemy's bullet, but by the cold, unforgiving eyes of his own kin. Life in the Apache camp was a trial of patience. While Kyle worked to dispatch a trusted runner to Fort Lewis with a coded message for Major Morrison, Elara existed in a state of limbo. She was an object of intense suspicion, especially from Kale's sister Nalin, whose hostility was a constant, bitter shadow. For Nalin, Elara was not a person, but a symbol, a harbinger of the white world that had taken so much from her people. The simmering tension broke a week after their arrival. As a weary sheriff, Brody rode into the canyon under a flag of truce. His face was a mask of grim urgency. He had been found by Kale's runner and came bearing terrible news. "It's Thorne," Brody said, wasting no time as he stood before Kyle, Elara, and the Apache elder Kirik. "He's raised a posse of 50 men. He's telling everyone in Redemption Peak that Mrs. Vance was kidnapped by renegades. He's using your name," he said, looking at Elara as an excuse to ride in here and wipe this camp off the map. A wave of fury and fear rippled through the assembled warriors. Nalin shot Elara a look that clearly said, "I told you so. He's not coming to rescue me." Elara's voice cut through the murmur, sharp with rage. "He's coming to silence the two witnesses who can prove he murdered my husband." "Exactly," Brody affirmed. "He's twisted the truth to justify a massacre. Major Morrison is on his way with cavalry, but he's a full day behind. Thorne and his mob will be here by morning." The situation was desperate. The Apache were skilled fighters, but they were vastly outnumbered. A council was held around Kirik's fire, the flames dancing on grim faces. Some argued for scattering into the mountains, others for a doomed final stand. It was Elara stepping into the circle of firelight who offered a third option. "You can't fight them head-on, and you shouldn't have to run from your own home," she declared, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "Thorne is arrogant. He believes he's in control. We have to use that against him." Kyle moved to her side, his presence a silent wall of support. "She is right," he said to the elders. "A trap. We don't give him the battle he wants. We give him the justice he deserves." Together they laid out a daring plan. They would use the canyon's narrow entrance as a choke point. The camp would be made to look deserted, luring Thorne and a small party, including his paid lawman, Deputy Miller, deep inside. Sheriff Brody would act as a parley to slow the posse and ensure the right men entered the trap. Apache warriors would line the cliffs above, not to kill, but to intimidate and cut off any retreat. The final confrontation would be a reckoning, not a war. It was a plan born of desperation and cunning, blending a frontierswoman's logic with an Apache's knowledge of the land. As the council agreed, and the warriors began to prepare, Nalin approached Ilara in the twilight. The open hostility in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, grudging respect. "Your plan is a clever one, white woman," she said quietly. "It has the cunning of the coyote." She pressed a small, beaded leather pouch into Ilara's hand. "This holds medicine for courage. My brother believes in you. Tonight I will believe in my brother." Ilara clutched the pouch, a silent understanding passing between them. An alliance had been forged, not just of necessity, but of a shared will to survive. Dawn broke, painting the canyon walls in hues of blood and gold. The camp was eerily silent, the wickiups empty, the women and children hidden safely away. On a ledge overlooking the canyon's entrance, Ilara stood with Cale and Sheriff Brody, her Winchester feeling like a natural extension of her arm. Soon the dust of Thorne's posse appeared on the horizon. The rancher rode at their head, a self-styled hero, leading a mob of 50 armed men. As planned, Brody rode out to meet them. "Hold your fire, Joshua," the sheriff's voice echoed. "Mrs. Vance is alive. She'll talk to you to prove she's not a captive." Thorne, suspicious, but trapped by the audience he had created, agreed. Leaving his posse behind, he and Deputy Miller rode into the narrow pass. They found the clearing, and they found Ilara standing not as a victim, but as a judge. When Kyle stepped out from the shadows beside her, Thorne's face went white. "You," he whispered, staring at Cale as if at a ghost. "You should have made sure I was dead." Kyle's voice was ice. As Deputy Miller frantically reached for his pistol, a sharp whistle pierced the air. A volley of arrows slammed into the ground around the horses, which screamed and threw their riders. Instantly, the cliffs above were lined with Apache warriors, their bows drawn in silent, deadly promise. The trap was sprung. "It's over." Thorne Brody said, his pistol aimed at the downed men. "You're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Vance." Cornered and exposed, Thorne exploded with rage. He lunged not at the armed men, but at Ilara, his hands closing around her throat. But Kyle was on him in a flash, a blur of motion that sent both men crashing to the ground in a brutal, desperate brawl. The fight was short and savage. Kale, though wounded by Thorne's knife, used the man's rage against him, slamming his head against a rock. Dazed, Thorne slumped to the ground. Kyle stood over him, breathing heavily, but he stepped back, leaving the final act to the law. As Brody moved in with cuffs, Thorne made his last venomous move. He pulled a hidden derringer from his boot and fired not at his captors, but directly at Ilara. Time seemed to slow. Kyle moved without thought, driven by the vow etched onto his soul. He threw himself in front of her, shoving her to the ground. The crack of the small pistol was sharp and final. Kyle cried out, staggering, as the bullet tore into his side. Before Thorne could fire again, 2 shots rang out, as one from Sheriff Brody's Colt and from Ilara's Winchester. Joshua Thorne fell into the dust, his reign of terror ended by the lawman he'd mocked and the woman whose life he had destroyed. Ilara was at Kyle's side. In an instant, her fear for him eclipsing everything else. "The bullet just grazed me," He grunted his eyes, finding hers full of a love that was fierce and unwavering. "I told you I would protect you." As the Apache descended from the cliffs, Narlen knelt beside her brother, her hands working to staunch the bleeding. She looked at Alara, and in her eyes was the dawn of a new understanding. When Major Morrison's cavalry finally arrived, they found a scene that would become legend. A corrupt posse disarmed a murderer brought to justice, and a new peace being forged. Alara Vance never returned to her silent cabin. Her home was no longer a place of ghosts, but a place beside the man who had honored his vow, a place in a canyon where two different worlds had bled together and begun to heal as one. The Wild West was a land of brutal endings, but for Alara Vance and the Apache scout named Cale, it was the beginning. Theirs was a story not just of survival, but of transformation, proof that the deepest prejudices can be overcome by courage, and that the truest love is often found in the most unexpected places. They stood together, a bridge between two worlds, their shared future a testament to the fact that even in a land scarred by hatred and conflict, a love forged in truth can heal the deepest wounds. Their legend reminds us that justice is worth fighting for, and that the most sacred vows are the ones written on the heart. If their story of courage and love against all odds moved, you please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who appreciates tales from the untamed heart of the American West. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next story from the frontiers of history.